We come now to Nadine Gordimer's short fiction masterpiece, The Moment Before the Gun Went Off, a narrative defining history. The story's based in realism, but it's fused with a strong political intent which we can discern despite the old shibboleth of the intentional fallacy, the notion of a couple of literary critics named Beardsley and Wimsatt that the intention in a work of literature cannot truly be determined. This work is all point of view. We know, for example, that Gordimer was a very strong opponent to apartheid. I want to get into that, but nevertheless, the story's narrator is a racial bigot. He's a supporter of apartheid, of the policies that were apparent at a time when those policies of racial exclusion and segregation based on race were being dismantled. That's the moment, the historical moment of this story, which was first published in 1988, 3 years before Nadine Gordimer was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for, and I'm quoting from the award itself, her magnificent epic writing, which was cited as being of great benefit to humanity. Now here's a writer who was quite political, but nevertheless creates a realistic story, a credible story that we believe that is shaped by a point of view antithetical to hers. It really is a testament, again, to her masterfulness as a storyteller, that she can bring this off and that she can bring it out without moralizing, but nevertheless bring a political intent into the fabric, into the warp and woof of the narrative. This story appeared in 1991 in a collection of short stories called Jump, the year following the abolition of apartheid, and it focused on ordinary South Africans. In essence, The Moment Before the Gun Went Off is about a young black farmhand named Lucas being accidentally shot and killed by a freak accident that involves a gun discharging. The youth is 20 years old. He's in the truck of Marius van der Vyver, who's an Afrikaner farmer, and who is also leader of the pro-apartheid political party. Van der Vyver seemed to have developed a bond with this, quote, black boy, and to have taken on a role as a friend and a mentor. What we discover, tragically, is that the boy is actually Van der Vyver's son. Nadine Gordimer was the daughter of Jewish immigrants. As I said, an anti-apartheid activist, apartheid being that system that for many years reigned in South Africa based on race separation, race exclusion, and race as the central determining factor for individual rights. Gordimer said in an often quoted line from a 1965 essay, "A writer in South Africa," which first appeared in London Magazine, "politics is character in South Africa." And you can again see political intent in her work at the same time that she's able to absent herself and remove herself in a voice that is not hers, and a voice which is distinctly antithetical in its political opinion of hers, and yet nevertheless convey what needs to be conveyed. There's almost sympathy in some of her stories for some of the apartheid supporters, for their humanity, for the way they're maimed also by a system that's inhuman. She was born in a mining town called Springs. In 1923, she settled in Johannesburg after receiving an education but not graduating from Witwatersrand University. Gordimer published her first story at the age of 15, and she once commented that not even winning the Nobel Prize was as thrilling as seeing a story of hers in print at that age. Her first collection of stories, Face to Face, was published in 1949. She once remarked that, quote, "the short story is the literary form of our age," end quote. But she's also written many novels and essays and has been awarded a host of honors in addition to the Nobel Prize, including the Booker Prize and the Orange Prize. That's a prestigious UK, United Kingdom literary prize for the best original novel by a woman of any nationality writing in the English language. And of interest here is the fact that Gordimer refused to accept shortlisting on the Orange Prize in 1988 for political reasons, because it was awarded only to women. This was someone who was certainly not afraid of taking political stands, and strong and passionate ones. She was also awarded a literary prize by the French Legion of Honor. And in a 1968 international symposium on the short story, which was published in the Kenyan Review, she commented as to how the short story's presentation of discrete moments makes it true to the lived experience of modern life. It's well worth noting that she said, quote, "Short story writers see by the light of the flash. Theirs is the art of the only thing that one can be sure of, the present moment. Ideally, they have learned to do without explanation of what went before and happens after this point," end of quote. Well, what went before the gun went off is really the key to this story. I want to talk a bit more about Gordimer, though. 3 of her books were actually banned during the apartheid years. And she built a good deal of her distinguished literary career writing about the moral and political as well as the psychological dimensions of living under apartheid, which throughout her adult life she opposed fiercely. In fact, she was a member of the Black-led African National Congress when that group was officially banned and considered revolutionary under the Afrikaners. And she was a longtime friend and supporter of the ANC leader Nelson Mandela, who would become head of the state in South Africa. That was, of course, after apartheid was abolished. Despite her strong political views, which included anti-censorship activism, serving as vice president of PEN International and working on behalf of causes related to HIV/AIDS, Gordimer was not polemical in this story and is not polemical in most of her stories. She begins with the shocking lead sentence. Marius van der Wyver shot one of his farm laborers dead, and then presents the story from this point of view of a friend of van der Wyver's who's never named, a neighbor of his who still believes in apartheid and sees the changes from its being dismantled as hastening chaos. The story is really ultimately about one of what Gordimer once called those backyard relationships, miscegenation, love between black and white that took place furtively, secretly, but was never acknowledged during the apartheid years and in fact was outlawed. Gordimer, we should say, was strongly influenced as a short fiction writer by Chekhov in her strong allegiance to realism and her avoidance of moralizing. But another major influence was a political theorist, a Hungarian Marxist, philosopher, literary critic named Lukács, who believed in realism as a form of social criticism. Lukács saw social existence as determining consciousness and literary art as a mirror for that. He perceived the importance of the contrast of a character's appearance of consciousness as opposed to the reality underlying that appearance of an independent reality. We've often seen in literature, of course, this distinction between appearance and reality. It's at the heart of many great short stories, many short story masterpieces. But it's as if underneath the reality is another reality, and that's a lot of what this great story keys us into. The story, again, is set as apartheid is beginning to crumble, and the narrative defines and clarifies that historical moment. The Immorality Act, as it was called, prohibited miscegenation between the races. It was wiped out by the time this story unfolds. It was, in fact, repealed in 1985. We're told by the narrator, not without disapproval, that it is now lawful and permissible for blacks and whites to sleep together. Violent acts are being carried out by blacks against whites, as the narrator makes us aware of urban police stations burning down and the necessity for security and barbed wires. In fact, van der Wyver has one. He's a white farmer, and this is commonplace for white farmers. Van der Wyver, we're informed early on by the narrator, serves as commandant of the local security commando. So what we get from the point of view of the narrator is the sense again of racial division, of racial separation, of a white man who views black people from a tainted apartheid perspective and who views them, well, at least in terms of those who are causing trouble, as troublemakers. Broader perspectives are successfully dramatized in the story by Gordimer's providing us in the story with this point of view. That is, we go beyond what could be a polemical point of view because we actually believe in and are anchored in the point of view of an apartheid supporter. His sympathies are clearly with white supremacy. And the point of view creates an even greater irony and unmasks even more the cruelty and damages wrought by apartheid. Now, you would think on the face of it, since blacks were excluded and mistreated under apartheid and oppressed, that they were the ones who, for the most part, suffered. But this is where we get under that reality and a reality underneath. Because we discover, of course, that white people suffered in different ways as well. Van der Wyver suffers as a result of apartheid, we find out, even though he's one of its strong supporters. Even the narrator, we discover, is damaged by apartheid, even though he's a white supremacist, as is Van der Wyver. The narrator speaks like a white supremacist. He talks about agitators and infiltration. He generalizes in bigoted ways about blacks not protecting their children in the way whites do. And he has a close enough relationship to the story's protagonist, Marius van der Wyver, that he knows family secrets. Now, this is one of the advantages of having this point of view. It's not only an advantage to have the point of view of a man who is a white supremacist to make us see the reality and the invisibility of that reality that is not on the surface, certainly not the reality that, say, the newspaper reporters would make out of a story like this. Here's a white commandant, a apartheid supporter, a black youth is shot at his truck, and it looks very much like blacks being killed by white man and white man being careless and all of that. But we're told, not through Vanderwijver's point of view, but through this man who knows him, that he was weeping in the police station. In fact, the policeman who was interrogating him about the death of young Lucas was humiliated and embarrassed that he should be weeping over this black young man. It's important, again, that we get this from the point of view of his neighbor. And we get the sense, of course, of what the view is of whites toward blacks. We get the sense of a broader perspective as this historical moment takes place. But we also are able to learn the biological relationship of Vanderwijver and the black youth Lucas. It would have been far less effective if, let's say, it were told from Vanderwijver's point of view. I lost my son. It would have given away everything from the beginning. And the narrator is also part of this wider farming community that understands to a deeper degree what Vanderwijver experiences. What he experiences, again, is completely antithetical to the news reports or the political way that is inferred from the world at large in terms of this particular tragedy, or the way they might infer about this particular tragedy. There's a lot of irony in the story. There's irony, for example, in the Afrikaner narrator's belief that the worldview outside his community is a polarized one, being all black and white. Why is that ironic? It's ironic because the apartheid system has been exactly that, totally polarized into black and white. The narrator becomes a human being in many ways for us, despite, well, what might be our lack of sympathy with his views. And his human view of what underlies the surface is different than what can so easily be construed and ultimately politicized. That appearance is far different, in other words, than the reality that he sees. But the reality that he sees is not really the reality. Again, the masterfulness of this story and the point of view being the integral and most important element to that point of to that. He doesn't see the reality beneath his own reality, which is one of moral evil, one of the consequences of apartheid. We learn from the narrator, again, how Vanderwijver and the young mother of Lucas communicate at the gravesite. We don't know yet at that point that they had been lovers. We don't know yet that Vanderwijver is Lucas's father. But we're seeing things freshly and through the eyes of the narrator, who is the neighbor and friend and fellow farmer, white farmer. Vanderwijver is a leading member of the ruling party, but he's also a victim of apartheid. He's a man who, ironically, we discover from learning of his paternity, broke this law against miscegenation that existed under apartheid. And the Gordimer title story of her 1991 volume, Jump, is instructive here as well, for in it we meet a post-colonial white military operations head who discovers how blacks were actually treated under apartheid, under the apartheid regime. After apartheid is swept away, he is tortured and besieged by images of the kind of carnage that was wrought by the policies that he was complicitous in establishing. The point is, as Gordimer shows in work both before and after apartheid, suffering was endured from both sides of the color line because of this system, this wicked system of apartheid and all that it engendered. And when I say that Gordimer does all this without being polemical, I simply mean that she gives us the point of view of those who feel guilty, of those who feel struck by their conscience, of those who suffer in one way or another, even though they were complicitous, even though they were part of the apartheid structure. We learn about Vanderwijver from the narrator, and yet the narrator in many ways can be seen as unreliable. He's unreliable because he's bigoted, for one thing. He's unreliable also because, well, he's not a man that we necessarily trust because of that bigotry. He nevertheless is able to create for us a sense of round characterization of Vanderwijver, of the subtleties of this man's character. Make someone who on the face of it would seem worthy of condemnation, like in the story Jump, someone who is a part of the regime, but nevertheless who becomes more human. When we think about Vanderwijver weeping in the police station after we finish the story, we think about a father weeping for the loss of his son. And so how cruel that system of apartheid was, even though Vanderwijver was a staunch supporter of it. We find out a lot about Vanderwijver from the narrator, even though the narrator, as I said, is not one that we necessarily sympathize with any more than we sympathize with Vanderwijver because of his politics, and yet we sympathize with both perhaps because of their humanity. The narrator is very confused about all of this that's happening in the wake of apartheid being dismantled, the kind of protests that are going on, landmines, almost revolutionary type of actions. Remember that Rhodesia had changed into Zimbabwe, and there was a lot of land taken away under Robert Mugabe, taken away from the white farmers. And there's a great deal of fear and apprehension underneath the story that's being told by this white farmer. And the farmers feeling they have to protect their land, they have to protect what's theirs from essentially this wave of change that's bringing with it Mandela and bringing with it black nationalism and the African National Congress, which was revolutionary and was outlawed and did believe at one time in violent overthrow. It's an extraordinary, well, something almost that can't be believed on the face of it. If you remember back to before apartheid, that things happened the way they did without there being even more bloodshed, without being a tidal wave of bloodshed. We find out about Vanderwijver's early shyness from this narrator, and also about his relationship with his father, his belief that a farmer's sacred duty, for example, is to raise game as well as cattle. And we discover from the narrator how his mother felt Vanderwijver didn't mix adequately with other children when he was a boy, which his wife, Elida, felt kept him from becoming his party's candidate for the district. Irony in that phrasing about not mixing well, of course. It's also a subtle but ironic and revelatory touch that Elida, his wife, is dressed out of respect at the boy's funeral, as she would for a white funeral. It's so remarkable because that captures the moment of change that we're going through historically. For a white woman to dress like she would for a white funeral for a black boy would have been unheard of, totally unacceptable. But she realizes that this boy's death has taken its toll on her husband. And we realize that not only by the fact that she's dressed for a white as a testament, but we realize that also by dint of the fact that we've learned already what kind of effect it's had on him, is weeping in the police station. Now, her wife might think he's just a kind of surrogate son, but we know, of course, and find out at the end, that he's the actual son. We learn of Vanderwijver's teaching Lucas hunting and tractor maintenance, and the fact that the boy is killed by Vanderwijver's father's rifle, and that's another symbolic link to the apartheid past. This is transgenerational. There was, of course, in South Africa, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, was involved in this, and many white South Africans like Gordimer were involved in it as well. But there's a sense behind these stories that all of the truth has to be told, just like there was in the Truth and Reconciliation, that you go back generations and you go back to some of the horrors of Stephen Biko and some of these so-called agitators who were heroes, of course, to the blacks in South Africa, and the torture that went on and the killings that went on, and you begin to realize, again, that Gordimer is trying to tell these stories, but trying to tell them not in a way that would say all is black and white, because there are many shades of gray, and they're moral shades of gray. It's one of the astonishing things about many of these short story masterpieces is that they show us worlds that are morally gray, worlds that are ambivalent. The pacing of the story is inevitable, but it's fluid in its representation of time. The story moves from the fact of Lucas's death and how it happened to the funeral, and then once again back in time to that moment before the gun went off. And the trajectory of the story ultimately moves back to that moment before the gun went off. And the fact of the death, and the final O. Henry-like revelation from the narrator, which almost seems like the kind of effect one might imagine if a shot were actually set off or fired. It's again, I think, a credit to Gordimer's craft that she can handle the time shift so adroitly and successfully. It keeps our suspense, it keeps us wondering what happens, but it also has that jolt at the end that almost seems like a shock when we find out about the paternity. This story is pretty gripping. It's well told, but it also is infused with politics, make no mistake about that. Not necessarily intentionally trying to persuade us politically, but having a message about the way stories are told in public versus how they truly unfold, and the actual historical reality underneath the stories. In that sense, this is, like Atwood's story, another story about storytelling and how stories get told. Stories get told, well, because there's a public way that stories are perceived. Newspapers, for example, gossip, the point of view that may be biased, in this case black or white, whatever the case may be, the story seems to be telling us that there is another reality underneath that, another reality underneath the political reality that sees things often in black and white and says, this is good, this is evil. Much more complicated than that, much more multidimensional than that. And the persona, or the unreliable narrative point of view, is really quite remarkably effective. It's reminiscent of a famous novel by Ford Madox Ford called The Good Soldier, which also is a classic example of an unreliable narrator. The accidental death of the young black boy, Lucas, becomes a centerpiece of a kind of dismantling of the historical legacy of apartheid and allowing us to see the humanity of both sides and the suffering of both sides because of it. Gordimer's craft is of a high order. Everything from the scene paintings to the characterizations, the way she uses irony, even the employment of details such as the police captain, the one that Van der Wyver weeps in front of, writing passed on about Van der Wyver's father's death. Just a little detail like that, the euphemism of passed on. Or for that matter, the police captain's sympathy, what would seem his sympathy, which is tempered by the fact that he can't believe this man is weeping over the loss of a black man. Black boy. Gordimer combines great storytelling with a strong political message about the evil of apartheid, but without stepping in, without moralizing, without creating any sense of a homily or a sermon, without, in other words, being overtly didactic. And she even makes us aware from the story's outset of issues such as, well, the dangers of father's guns lying around homes and of hunting accidents. It's not necessarily that she's for gun control or anything like that, but she's really bringing us into a whole picture of how accidents happen, of how things take place. She's not saying, in other words, we should have gun control or anything even along those lines, talking like Americans do about NRA Second Amendment rights and all that sort of thing. She's just saying that, carelessness can lead, where guns are concerned, to death. But the real greatness of the story emerges from its sense of history, its ability to engender in us the historical narrative that is linked to a personal story. Again, as we've seen in so many of these stories, of ordinary people. We're able to see the macrocosm in the microcosm. We're able to see through the telescope and the microscope, through the type of, in this story, tragic accident that can and does occur every day, but that has much lying underneath it. The story also dramatizes, in a very deft way, the chasm that exists between the private world and what is made public after the gun goes off. Listen to this final paragraph. And remember, this is from our narrator whom we've met, who is somewhat dissociated from Van der Wyver, just a neighbor, but acquainted with him, wanting to tell his story, wanting to tell what he believes is the real story. But the irony underneath his unreliability, of course, is the story that's underneath that. How will they ever know when they file newspaper clippings, this is the narrator, evidence, proof, when they look at the photographs and see his face, guilty, guilty, they are right. How will they know when the police stations burn with all the evidence of what has happened now and what the law made a crime in the past? How could they know that they do not know anything? The young black callously shot through the negligence of the white man was not the farmer's boy. He was his son. So there you have it. There you have this narrator who is against the uprising, against the attempt to bring apartheid to a close completely, not even willing to accept the fact that there was an immorality act that was taken away, feeling in fact that blacks and whites should not be having sex or sexual union, should not be lovers. But yet he captures something here that's really quite real. That is, this might be looked at as a young black callously shot through the negligence of a white man. That might indeed be, given the political polarization, the way it's perceived. But the political polarization exists because of apartheid. There's, of course, the reality underneath that. And the political and underneath the reality of what is perceived, he's right, is the fact that this is the man's son. So we get the emotional wallop at the end of the story. We get the sense of a kind of push almost into another realm, into a realm which shakes us and makes us awaken to the fact that there are perceptions that we don't see on the surface. Not only of someone who is biased and whom we might disapprove of in terms of those biases, not only in terms of the public view of things as opposed to the private view, but in terms of what we would call reality, reality itself. Again, this story harkens us back to the whole notion of what storytelling is and the reality underneath it. When we talked about Margaret Atwood, we talked about the reality underneath fiction, which is the reality of death. But the reality underneath fiction goes deeper than just the recognition of death. The reality of fiction, which reflects life, which brings life forward, also shows us that in life there are other realities underneath, beyond what we see. And this makes for greater ambiguity, greater moral ambiguity. When we come to the end of the story, it certainly carries with it a punch, but it also carries with it a kind of epiphany or recognition. It becomes another story about understanding how stories are told and how stories are created. In that sense, it's self-reflexive. It's not the metafiction of Margaret Atwood. It's a very realistic and realistically grounded story, but nevertheless, it's a story that brings us once again into that sphere, into that realm, and makes us aware of storytelling and makes us aware how stories are created. We've seen a lot of tragic stories, certainly. But we're going to go next to a much more upbeat story, with an ending that is climactic, just like this story, but which, with its climax, brings us an uplifting sense, almost really what I somewhat hesitatingly would call a spiritual sense. It's by a contemporary writer who is younger than Nadine Gordimer, who wrote a story that preceded the moment before the gun went off. We're going a little backward chronologically here, but we're going forward in the sense of a writer who can create an ending that can really lift us, almost literally lift us. Raymond Carver is often deemed, like Nadine Gordimer, to be one of the greatest story writers of the 20th century. He's an American writer of working class background, often compared also to Chekhov. And we come back to the importance of Chekhov, singular in short story writing, often called the father of the modern short story. We see his influence in Gordimer in terms of the not moralizing in her story, but we see a different kind of influence in Raymond Carver, which we'll talk about when we talk about that story. It's a little play on what we talk about when we talk about Love, which was the name of his second volume. But this is his best-known short story. It's from his third volume, from his last volume, actually, of short stories. And it's the next story that we're going to deal with, and it's called Cathedral. We now come to the highly elevating story by America's Chekhov, Raymond Carver, a story called Cathedral. From the opening paragraph, we get a distinctive voice that will carry us through this whole story, and it catches us. It's the voice of a man, a plain man really, living in a troubled marriage, a job he doesn't like. We don't find out what that job is, but we know he doesn't like it, but has to do it. And he's awaiting a visit from a blind man named Robert, who was an old friend of his wife's. Robert comes to visit, and the narrator resents the intrusion. He's also jealous of the intimacy that Robert has established with his wife. Nevertheless, he acts cordial, they drink, they eat together with the wife, then they drink some more, then they watch television, and Robert and the narrator smoke marijuana, Robert trying it for the first time, and as the narrator's wife falls asleep, a television show comes on late having to do with cathedrals. The narrator struggles to explain to Robert what cathedrals look like, and then Robert suggests they attempt drawing one together. And they do. That, in short order, is what occurs in the story. A kind of bare-bones synopsis which cannot in any fashion communicate the power of this story as art, as transcendence, as a story of intimacy, and as consciousness-expanding substances all act together with intimacy and with transcendence in a rare combination to give us a story ending that is, in my opinion, about as good as story endings get. The ending not only feels climactic and satisfying, as a short story ending should, and as many that we have studied certainly have, but it also moves beyond the ending in death or tragedy or even ambiguity that we've seen in so many stories. It's not a happy ending. Atwood showed us that perhaps there are maybe none of those in this contemporary complex world, but it is surely an uplifting ending. Carver's called America's Chekhov because he's a realist and because his stories tie so deeply to humanity, but in an American context. Like Chekhov, he believed in short stories being objective, truthful, warm-hearted, and brief, and reflecting the lives of ordinary people. His output was not as great as Chekhov's. Few short storytellers have that kind of output, but he published 4 volumes of stories in his lifetime, as well as a number of single stories that appeared separately and some that were published after his death. He was also a much-published poet. One of his last stories, unlike any of the stories in his oeuvre, is a story called Aaron, a tale of Chekhov's death, and a tribute to the man that Carver saw as his mentor. What's especially notable in this story is that the focus at the end of the story is on a young man who is in the service class and who is asked by Olga, Chekhov's wife, to do an errand in the wake of her husband's death. It's a story about Chekhov, but it's also a story about this young man who is tangential and, if you will, a player in the drama of Chekhov's life, who, as I said, is essentially someone who runs errands, who does service work. These are the people that Carver was often concerned about in his fiction. These are the people that his fiction often focuses on. Service people, people who play subaltern roles or lesser, or certainly more ordinary roles in society. Carver was labeled as a minimalist, which he rejected. Minimalist art was identified with Alex Katz, the painter, and with writers like Ann Beatty. But he was stylistically much more influenced by Hemingway, just writing pared-down, compressed sentences that are flat and declarative. Most of Carver's stories are about the working class, and they're set in the Northwest. They were described as low-rent tragedies, that phrase first used to describe Carver's characters, not pejoratively. In a 1981 issue of the New York Review of Books by critic Robert Towers, in a review of Carver's volume of stories that preceded the volume Cathedral, called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And I ought to add here that Carver's writing as a short storyteller was really much more downbeat until he got to Cathedral. What we talk about when we talk about love is the second most anthologized Carver story, and probably the second most highly regarded story of his behind Cathedral. But it's a story which leaves us with 4 people seated around trying to understand what love is and being mystified by what it is, telling their stories to each other, particularly a cardiologist by the name of Mel, who talks about his spiritual training and wanting to love beyond himself and loving his wife deeply and passionately and now hating her because he's gone through a divorce and she has custody of the children. And so it's kind of what is love? And Mel tells a story about a couple who wind up in the emergency room and are near death, and the husband only wants to look at his wife, who's completely bandaged up, but he just wants to stare at her, trying to grasp that sense of agape, of a higher, almost spiritual love, of romantic love, of what love is. And so they talk about love, and it's a lot of talking in a kind of Platonic symposium that ends with them sitting around, having had too much gin, just sort of immobilized almost. And so many of Carver's earlier stories have that sense of immobility, of characters who are lost, who are paralytic in many respects, who make mistakes, who do things in life that really screw up their lives. And yet in Cathedral, we get a very different kind of story. We get a story that Carver probably was more prone to write, not only because he was in a better place in his life, married to the poetess Gallagher, his second marriage, lionized as perhaps one of the greatest short story writers in American literature, and getting a lot of recognition after he had worked as a janitor and done all kinds of menial jobs and lived that kind of life, hand to mouth, and a very difficult and a very challenging life, like the characters he writes about. The narrator in Cathedral is alienated from his work, in the Marxist sense of being alienated. We don't even know what kind of work he does, as I said, but we know he dislikes it. He feels he has no choice but to do it. He and his wife have a new sofa. They have a colored television that they traded up for. But his idiom, his vernacular speech, are essentially working class. This is the first paragraph from Cathedral. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died. So he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago. But she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. Well, aside from that last sentence, calling to mind that old joke about Winston Churchill saying to someone who said, "You should never end a sentence with a preposition, that is something up with which I will not put," we get a kind of flat, maybe even a little bit dull declarative voice here of a man who nevertheless is self-revelatory and is showing us how he feels about the fact that someone is coming into his territory, into his bailiwick, into his home, and he's not happy about it. He's also revealing himself in the sense that he says, I had this idea of what blind men were like. I wasn't comfortable with them. A lot of people with other people who have disabilities don't feel that kind of comfort or feel uncomfortable even. I mean, I remember when I was younger and met a blind person for the first time, I felt I had to watch my language. I couldn't say things like, oh, I see that, or whatever, because I felt it would make the blind person feel uncomfortable. That kind of sensitivity that we have that may be overly sensitive. In fact, he really resents the blind man. He resents the blind man coming into his house, and he resents the fact that the blind man is so close to his wife. She read things to him at one time. They had an intimacy that involved, when they said goodbye, his feeling every part of her face, including, the narrator says, her neck. And that particularly seems to put him off, as if the neck is a kind of erogenous zone where he was trespassing the blind man by being tactile. And tactile has a lot to do with the story. Touching, as we'll find out, has a great deal to do with the story, just the human touch and the sense of what can come through the human touch. But what we find in the story initially is this resentment. This guy's coming to my home. We find out in the course of the story, in fact, that not only have they been sending tapes back and forth, but at one point the wife says, I want you to hear one of these tapes. And she puts on a tape from the blind man, and he says, in effect, ask for your husband. And they fortify themselves with drinks before he hears the tape, and then there's some strange noise, and he says, I didn't want to hear what he had to say. Now, if somebody you were in love with and living with and was a mate of yours or whatever, got a tape from somebody else they were close to, and they were about to say something about you, and you knew that they were communicating with each other about you, you'd, I think, want to hear what they had to say. But this narrator doesn't even want to hear. And that's revealing of the fact that there's trouble in his marriage. In fact, early on, he says, well, maybe I could take him bowling, about the blind man. I mean, there's that sarcasm and that, like all the jokes on Saturday Night Live about Stevie Wonder and jokes that are in bad taste about blind people. But he comes up with these jokes because he feels resentful and he feels a sense of, being threatened by this man coming into his home, this man with whom his wife has communicated, with whom she has communicated in a close and intimate way that he is not capable of, clearly not capable of. And the wife seems a little bit ditzy too. We find out about her past, and we find out that she's tried to commit suicide and she's had problems of her own. But this from the beginning is a sense of a marriage without intimacy. She says to him, if you love me, you'll just this once do what I'm asking and be good to him because he's important to me, or words to that effect. And he in turn says, well, I don't have any blind friends. And she says, you don't have any friends. And indeed, we feel the narrator's isolation. We feel his aloneness, but we also feel that he loves his wife. Really, when the blind man, in fact, comes into the house, there's a lot of humor about her thigh being exposed, but then he figures, oh, what the hell, the guy's blind, what does it matter? Well, he's a simple man in many ways, but a man, nevertheless, who has real emotion and who has trouble communicating that emotion. He uses a lot of single words to summarize his feelings. Pathetic, spiffy, first sees the blind man, the way he's dressed, but also pathetic about the blind man. Creepy, crazy. The passage in which he describes the way they eat together is especially revelatory of his lower middle class or working class roots, but something happens. After the blind man comes in, they sit down, they get acquainted, he tries to be polite, and they sit down and eat. And in Carver's stories, in a number of Carver stories, and particularly in this story, something happens, almost a kind of communal thing happens when people eat. The narrator describes with great gusto the way they eat. They scarf and they graze and they eat with great intensity. Nevertheless, it begins to prepare us for his moving closer to, or feeling more disposed toward moving closer to, the blind man, to establishing some kind of relationship or rapport with him. He also finds out that the blind man has lost his wife, that he's a widower. And this makes him somewhat more sympathetic as well. In other words, what happens through the course of the story is an opening up in a pretty simple, plain, ordinary kind of guy, Joe Sixpack you could almost call him, to someone else's humanity. Not just seeing him as a blind man as he would see him in the movies or on television, but seeing him as a real human being. And something happens that's really quite magical in the nature of transformation as a result of these two human beings coming together as they do. The portrayal of the narrator reaches into a life which is pretty empty. Samuel Beckett, in the Waiting for Godot, called Habit the Great Deadener. We get a sense that he's living a life that's so habitual that it's deadening. He's anesthetizing himself with television, with alcohol. It's that life of quiet desperation that Thoreau talked about, which in Walden he said most of us live. He's got alcohol, he's got television, he's got marijuana, all of these things, but underneath this is a desire for intimacy and love within his marriage, which is possibly even crumbling. It's certainly dysfunctional. But nevertheless, we get that sense. He's not a man who reads poetry, he tells us. He's not a man who understands a lot of these kinds of things that are intricate and have to do with the inner life. But he wants to enrich that inner life somehow. That comes across to us. His humanity comes across to us. And Cathedral, by the way, I should mention, is based on an actual encounter with a blind man friend of Carver's second wife, the poet Tess Gallagher. She, in fact, wrote a story after Carver's story appeared of the same episode from her point of view, which really doesn't establish, this is not to insult Tess Gallagher, it simply doesn't have the power that Carver had as a storyteller, or the clarity of voice, or the way of engaging us as readers. Really doesn't have the artfulness. Tess Gallagher saw herself primarily as a poet. Carver, on the other hand, was also a poet, but despite wide publication of many of his poems, he was a far better storyteller than he was a poet. And the richness of a story like Cathedral is in the power of the story's emotional conclusion and in, as I've suggested, its overall humanity. A good deal of Carver's work, like so many of the short story writers we've read, was autobiographical, but he took that material. It was grist for the mill. Mill is an appropriate word here because he worked in a mill, and so did his father. It was grist for his mill as a fiction writer. He was born in 1938 in Clatskanie, Oregon, grew up in Yakima, Washington, so was of the Northwest. His father, as I said, was a mill worker, his mother a retail clerk and waitress, and both Carver and his father were alcoholics. By the age of 20, Carver was married, had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and he struggled. He struggled through, as I said, many menial and service-type jobs to provide for his family. He would later write about how providing for and taking care of children was his greatest single obstacle as a writer and a source of deep resentment. And he wrote about this openly and candidly, and I dare say in some ways courageously. how he resented his own children because they kept him from writing. Still, in spite of all of this travail, he managed to become educated in California colleges, Chico State, where his mentor and a very important figure in his life was the novelist John Gardner. And he studied at Humboldt State. Later on, he went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He published his first story in 1960 and proceeded to publish short stories and poems that he would write out of economic necessity. And he had a very complicated relationship with an editor named Gordon Lish, who had been the fiction editor at Esquire magazine. It's a complicated relationship because, well, Carver acceded to a lot of the requests and demands that Lish put on him as an editor. And there's a lot of controversy about how much certain stories belonged to Carver and how much they belonged to Lish. Later, this became very embittered, this relationship, and Lish took a lot more of the lion's credit that many people feel he deserved. Certainly, he was important in a lot of the stories, the early stories of Carver's. Carver also wrote essays and reviews, was a literature teacher at a number of universities, with most of his teaching career spent at Syracuse University in upstate New York. Cathedral was published in 1981 in the Atlantic Monthly, and as a volume under the title Cathedral in 1984. And Carver, a heavy smoker all his adult life, died of lung cancer in 1988. Two stories that epitomize for me who Carver was have to do with, well, once he had become really a famous writer. He was being translated into French, and the French translator was working with the translation that he was doing and said to someone, you know, I thought when I was working with this material that maybe this man was making fun of these lower class people, that he was being sarcastic or being, well, even nasty to some degree. And then he said, I looked at Carver's face, at his photograph, and I knew that wasn't the case. That'll give you some indication of how Carver carried almost within his physical features, or the physical features of his face, who he was and what he was. And who he was and what he was can also be exemplified by a story that took place at the University of California, Berkeley, when Carver again had established himself as a major writer and was given all that recognition of being a major writer. He went to the University of California at Berkeley, and they put him in a seminar with graduate students in American literature, very select seminar of only a few students who were serious students of Carver's and other American writers. And Carver said, you have a class here in the English department called Dumbbell English for remedial students. I'd like to go to that class. I'd like to talk to them. In other words, there was an affinity he had with people who I suppose could be described as down and outers, or people who were marginalized by class or by being in something like remedial English. And the narrator we meet here is one of those people. He's one of Carver's people. And he goes through an experience here that is quite unique. It's a story of human transformation. It's a story, well, what great stories enable us to do, as I said early on, is to see. And I quoted the poet Adrian Rich, who said, seeing is changing. This is a narrator enabled to see by a man who cannot see, and enabled to go through change as a result of that experience. As I said, there's a build-up toward greater intimacy between the two. And after the narrator gets past the stereotyping and the jealousy, as well as following a good deal of eating, drinking, and smoking pot, there is this sense that they're able to talk to each other, that they're able to strip away some of the barriers that normally might present themselves as obstacles to human communication. The narrator from early on resented, as I said, the blind man's coming into his home, who was jealous of the intimacy between his wife and the blind man. But this changes in the course of the story. The narrator's empathy builds. His warmth toward Robert builds. Some of this has to do with Robert, the blind man, who's a kind of hale-hearty, well-met fellow, filled with a kind of exuberance and bonhomie. But the narrator is also able to override his own stereotyping, even though he has this initial resentment at first. He's able to overcome this in the process of the story, and he's able to meet Robert on a one-to-one level. As I said, that stereotyping begins to diminish at first when the narrator realizes that Robert has a beard, and then The stereotyping begins to diminish when the narrator realizes that Robert has a beard. Somehow in his mind, blind men aren't linked to beards, or they're not supposed to have beards. And then he admires the way Robert eats. He puts his peas on a knife, and he's able to scoop them up and do them quite adroitly. He admires the fact that he smokes the cigarettes down to the nubbin. All these details we get, like Chekhovian details. And he even admires, of course, the fact that he smokes marijuana, trying it for the first time, but also like he's been doing it since he was 7 years old. Narrator also feels empathy for Robert's loss of his wife. But here again, we see the narrow perspective of this narrator. We're told that the wife's name was Beulah. And he asks, is she a Negro? And his wife says, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? Well, it's because he watches a lot of television. There was a television show back in the 50s called Beulah with Ethel Waters, the great actress of black stage and screen, and Butterfly McQueen, who made herself famous in a role in Gone with the Wind, the one with the real high voice. By the 1950s, this was a popular television program about a black maid named Beulah. So that's his frame of reference. Blind men he sees in the movies or on television. Name Beulah immediately sets off, like a Pavlovian response, stimulus response. The name Beulah sets off the association with the character on television. The wife leaves Robert and the narrator alone. And when she returns, they're actually drawing this cathedral together. Because Robert, through his warmth and his good fellowship, has made, or allowed for, a rather deep human connection with the narrator, and the narrator has let Robert in. He's allowed him into his life. In fact, by this point, he really wants to please him. That's why they're drawing the cathedral together. Robert's character is able to create this breakthrough. It's a kind of channeling that occurs over late-night television. Remember channeling, when people thought that they were communing with spirits or getting into a different level? Well, some of that is going on in this story. Robert's upbeat. He's a man's man. He repeatedly uses the word bub to describe the narrator. Well, bub, what are you doing? And well, bub, but it's friendly. He defies all those stereotypes the narrator has about blindness, and he manages, along with the substances, to raise the narrator's consciousness to a much higher level. And I need to mention the fact that there is a lot of drinking. In so many of Carver's stories, there's a lot of drinking, a lot of smoking. And in this story, use of marijuana. I need to mention that because here's this resplendent and crowning and extraordinary ending that we'll talk about in a moment. And some say, well, it was induced by cannabis, that is, by marijuana, or it's tied somehow to the use of marijuana. Therefore, it doesn't necessarily have the legitimacy that it would have if there hadn't been marijuana, let alone alcohol, to precede the marijuana. But something occurs which is really quite genuine in this story, in the way of transformation, in the way of elevation of consciousness, in the way of elevating us as readers. Robert, as I said, is willing to learn. He's open to new experiences. And he makes the narrator more open as a result. It's almost a kind of infectious attitude. And ultimately, he acts like a coach with the narrator as the two of them bond over the drawing of the cathedral. How's the old arm doing? Well, the narrator is trying to draw this cathedral. Initially, the narrator tried to describe a cathedral, but remember, this is a man who is not that able where language is concerned, not a wordsmith, not even very good with language. So when he's asked to describe a cathedral, he wants to do this. He even imagines, again, see how much television plays into his imagination and forms his imagination and is his frame of reference. He thinks of a bad television script. Say my life depended on it. I had to describe a cathedral and I would die. Evil guy would kill me if I didn't. Well, he finally gets into this act, goes upstairs. We can tell he's a little bit stoned, rips off part of a paper bag, brings it down, and the two become partners in an artistic creation. Perhaps they become even homoerotic partners. Let me read this last section of Cathedral to you. So we kept at it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. And that's the phrase that has given a lot of people pauses. His fingers rode my fingers, and they're becoming closer, and they're becoming more intimate, and therefore it suggests something homoerotic. Well, I think it's deeper than that. I think it's a story about spirituality, just like the title Cathedral suggests, and brings us into that realm of the spiritual. And by the way, there's a lot of misgivings about using the word spiritual because Where I come from in California, it's often, people will say, well, I don't have a faith, I don't have a belief, but I'm a spiritual person. It's used as a kind of all too facile signifier. But this is a story that gets to a spiritual level, as we'll see. He says, his fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. What wonderful, understated sense of change and transformation and epiphany, if you wish, is going on here. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. This is a man who can't speak poetically because he doesn't have that facility or that ability. But nevertheless, he communicates so much. Again, like Hemingway, it's underneath the surface. Like Babel, it's underneath the surface. Then he said, that is Robert, I think that's it. I think you got it, he said. Take a look. What do you think? But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. Well, he said, are you looking? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house, I knew that. But I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. Somehow, when you get to that ending, it lifts you up. In fact, Tobias Wolff, who was a close friend of Carver's and a short story writer, author of This Boy's Life, among others. Carver had a little clique of writers. Richard Ford was another, also a short story writer, a novelist too, Pulitzer Prize winning. Carver gave the story to Tobias Wolff, to read, and Tobias Wolff's response was, I read it and I felt I actually levitated. Actually came up off the couch. This kind of spiritual transformation is something that can be experienced in the story, almost in a mystical way. It's a realistic story, make no mistake about it. It's grounded in realism, but it's a story that lifts us. It also is a story about a non-believer. At one point when they're looking at cathedrals on television, they're having a whole conversation about faith. And certainly a cathedral is a central signifier of faith, communion. We find out a little bit about how cathedrals were built over generations, to their celestial majesty, the communion that they may indeed represent and often do. But at one point, the narrator jokes about prayer when they're eating. And later on, although the eating is communal and brings him, as I said, closer to Robert, later on, when they're looking at cathedrals on the television, they get into a discussion about God and religion. And that's really what prompts them to draw this cathedral together. There is, in other words, at the end of the story, a spiritual transformation or a personal transformation or something of the two that comes at the end of the story, in contrast to the narrator telling Robert, after trying to explain what a cathedral is in language and failing to do so, that cathedrals mean nothing to him and they're simply something to look at on late-night TV. By the way, the television serves in this story, and in contrast to Paley's, an interest in life as a way perhaps into a higher level of consciousness, even though this character, our narrator, has become so imbued with all kinds of stereotypes because of television. So it's working both ways in a sense. Certainly the different way enters in this channeling at the end of the story. And it's probably PBS anyway. But then many of you are perhaps watching my high-minded lectures on a television screen. Cathedral is also a portrait of a marriage. We see the wife's past history unfold from the narrator's point of view, and from there we get glimpses into their marriage as well as into her previous marriage to an officer that he, the narrator, refuses to name, and her anger at what she calls, and he calls, the military-industrial complex. That's right out of the 60s, of course. And all about her poetry and the tapes to Robert, which, by the way, he sarcastically calls, next to her writing poetry, her chief means of recreation. The narrator's wife craves the kind of intimacy she has had with Robert in her marriage and is insecure about not having her husband's love, just as he's insecure about her. We see this insecurity early on in the story because he's amazed at how she smiles and beams when Robert comes on the scene, while she chastises him for asking Robert aloud which side of the train he sat on, and he feels she doesn't even like seeing him. And she gives him a savage look when she finds out about his bringing marijuana in. We get all of these details in the story, and yet the story is leading us not so much toward understanding the husband's relationship with his wife as creating a relationship between the husband, or narrator, and Robert. Despite the substances that affect the narrator, the story's final lines are spiritually uplifting. They're transcendent, as well as confirming the power of art. And perhaps those two can be threaded together. That is, the spiritual idea being wedded somehow to the artistic. And the story itself being told by this never-named narrator has the quality of being an artistic story, thereby reaching a kind of spiritual level. The act of drawing a cathedral together has an artistic or spiritual element that is wedded together. And like so many of the stories we have read and discussed wedded to realism, and like so many modern and postmodern masterpieces of short fiction, Carver's earlier work was in general bleak and downbeat, unhappy. Cathedral is not a happy story, nor is it a sentimental one. It's still a story based in realism. It is, however, an extraordinary story of great insight into the human condition, the ordinary and the extraordinary, and of a feeling, by the time we reach the conclusion of the story, of a rising up out of the quotidian or the mundane to a rare and uncommon human connectedness. It is ultimately closest in spirit, if you will, to Chekhov's The Lady with the Dog, where two ordinary people also make an uplifting, higher and more elevating connection to one another and see life in a way that they had never imagined it to be. Well, what's next for us is an ambitious attempt to come to some conclusions of our own about the short story and short story masterpieces. We'll talk about where we have been and where we might be headed, and what we can say in sum about this genre and the masterpieces in it that we have looked at and studied. Some final words, too, on evaluating short story masterpieces and on the value of reading and studying them. There are now last lectures that professors give as if they're preparing for the best content they can distill into a single ultimate lecture. This is our last lecture, so I want to say some final and important remarks about short fiction masterpieces, first by talking about their value and their length, and then about lying and truth and what makes a masterpiece, and how they get written and where they are published, and then some concluding remarks and observations about the democratization of the short story and its future. First, let me begin with a quote from the literary critic F.R. Leavis, who said that literature is the first distinction of a civilized man. He should have said of men and women, but nevertheless, you get the idea. The reason we read literature, the reason we read short fiction, is to be more civilized. It also goes back to Poe and the fact that a short story can be read and absorbed in a single sitting, when we're talking about short stories, of course. Think of all the sittings that you would do to read through all the stories we've read. Total words, 114,000. That's a small novel. So you make the choice. You're the reader. Would you prefer a single novel, a single great novel, or 23 short fiction masterpieces? Or would you prefer 23 short fiction masterpieces, an entree into the worlds of 23 great authors? Or again, that one single novel? We read great fiction, great short fiction, for knowledge, for excitement, for expansion of our sensibilities, and all the gifts that literature offers us in a compact and, for many, a more suitable, perhaps more accessible form than the novel, or the play, or the poem. V.S. Pritchett, another literary critic and writer, said the novel creates a bemusing effect while the short story wakes readers up and answers a craving for primitive art. Quote, the wit, paradox, and beauty of shape, the longing to see a dramatic pattern and significance in our experience, the desire for the electric shock, end of quote. Now, you may agree or disagree with Pritchett, but it is once again that flash that Nadine Gordimer spoke of in short fiction, the quickness of illumination that Joyce saw in Epiphanies, that could and often did carry, as with Maupassant and James, a lesson. All literature, as I've been saying, is intertextual, but we can learn more about the interrelatedness of literature and glean knowledge more swiftly from short fiction. I'm not trying to make a case to sell you on the value of short fiction. It's not a vacuum cleaner or something like that. My hope is that the course and the stories we've taken up have succeeded in doing that. Short stories act on us quickly and do, as we have seen, teach and entertain. Percy Lubbock, a literary critic who wrote a seminal book called The Craft of Fiction, wrote that fiction is both scenic and panoramic in narration. In other words, embodying a single event or being panoramic across a wider expanse of times, like we tend to identify with the novel. Both techniques of narration can be seen in great short fiction masterpieces, and we have been fortunate enough to see both in some of the greatest fiction writers from over a century and a half. Scenic single event, Joyce, Babel, Mansfield. Panoramic, Chekhov, Lawrence, Malamud. And in many instances, we've seen the best and most lasting work by some of the world's greatest and most distinguished writers. I urge you to keep reading short fiction because the talented storytellers who are out there from all over the world need and deserve thoughtful readers. And you stand to benefit more by reading great stories, great short stories, beyond perhaps what you might imagine. I hope you'll agree with the assumption that underlies this course, that there truly are great benefits in reading great short fiction, and that those stories that are worth reading and discussing and interpreting and evaluating are stories that can stay, and often indeed do stay, within you for a lifetime. That, above all, is why we call them masterpieces. Now, admittedly, the word masterpiece is a different signifier to different people, and it's a lofty word. It's a word that sounds highly elevating, maybe even unreachable. You think of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. But we're using the word masterpiece here from many of the vantage points that are used to evaluate and will continue to be used in evaluations of fiction or of art. But in fiction specifically, we're talking about craft. We're talking about language, voice, irony, mood, tone, setting, structure, plot and character, pacing, point of view, details, all of the elements that make up this wonderful miniaturized form of fiction we call the short story. But all central in the way the story is ultimately evaluated, and also central is the way the story affects us as readers, its impact, and the extent to which it can make us see, expand, or become part of who and what we are. Perhaps the masterpieces within the masterpieces, there is or maybe a hierarchy within a pantheon, and there's certainly a hierarchy within a pantheon of masterpieces. Perhaps the masterpieces within the masterpieces are those that allow us to grow and expand the most in our humanity, as they feature ordinary lives in extraordinary ways with which we can empathize, identify, and feel our own humanity. Think of what are perhaps three of the crown jewels of storytelling we saw resplendent in the stories we discussed by Chekhov, The Lady with the Dog, or Baldwin, Sonny's Blues, or Raymond Carver's Cathedral, since those three resonate with the kind of humanity I am speaking of. But there are those exquisite moments of humanity in so many of these great short story writers that we've discussed, including Gogol and James, Joyce, Babel, Hemingway, Kafka, Mansfield, Paley, O'Connor, Updike, and Gordimer. And we've seen how these and other writers we have studied can make complex and multidimensional human characters who allow us to see the whole panoply of human emotion. We've seen, too, how great storytellers can shape the raw material of life into great stories, and how this can often embody a search for the nature of the art they are fashioning and give us great stories about the creation of art, or that reflect on aesthetics, or the world of the artist. We've seen this in Poe, James, Kafka, Mansfield, Kingston, and Atwood. Short stories are short. Why are short stories so short? Well, there's an author who was quoted in the Times Literary Supplement who was asked why they're short, and his response was, because the author wants them no longer. That quip makes me think of Samuel Beckett's response when he was asked why his masterpiece drama, Waiting for Godot, was 2 acts. And he said, the 1 would have been too few and 3 too many. Exactly so with short fiction. It's short, but it's not too short. And once it becomes too long, it becomes something other than short fiction. Many from the gallery of great writers we have read and discussed are also great novelists. Yet the stories they chose to write were tied to the form of the short story, and in some cases, they can and have expressed a profound cultural moment. Think of Malamud's The Jewbird, or a profound historical moment like Nadine Gordimer's The Moment Before the Gun Went Off. They're both novelists, Malamud and Gordimer, but they're able to compress something quite different with respect to their vision into short tales. That kind of versatility is something we've seen in many of the authors that we've read. All fiction writers are liars. Mark Twain, in fact, said, in order to really be a writer of fiction, you got to be a liar. But they're liars who make us see truth. And great fiction must make us think or feel in distinct or new ways, but above all, great fiction has to make us see, as Carver's nameless narrator in Cathedral is ultimately able to see, ironically with the help of a blind man. In the masterpiece stories that we see, worlds open up to us. Great fiction should make us see the world of the author, even if we know nothing about who he or she is. Trust the tale and not the teller, D.H. Lawrence once said, and he was right. If the tale bears truth and makes us see truth, then it is a tale worth trusting and even exalting. If it comes on the heels of the made-up and concocted, the confabulated, the unreal, that's immaterial. Short fiction masterpieces remain ways for readers to be transported into the worlds that great literary artists build. And those worlds are swifter and more compact than the novel, a far more appropriate forum given our contemporary pace of day to day. I don't want to sound like I'm slighting the novel here. A great believer in the value of the novel as a genre. And I have a lot of faith in what the novel can provide. And I would also urge you to read novels, of course, as well. But short stories do give us, in that single sitting, as Poe said, the compressed vision of a world. And they give us a great deal in a swift manner as well. And they provide what literature has always traditionally provided, just in a more compact way. And so we come to that essential question again of whether or not we can design a litmus test to decide which stories are worthy of being put into that proverbial space capsule for the future that I spoke of in the first lecture. It's difficult to know what will excite or thrill our future readers, just as it may be impossible to say what nations our great masterpiece storytellers are likely to be emerging from. But great stories seem to possess a way intrinsically of moving us, affecting us, stirring or engaging us. And that's why horror stories like Poe's, Hawthorne's, and Gogol's, and nightmarish fairy tales like Jackson's The Lottery and D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winter, or Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, continue to have a hold on readers. Horror is one of those things that engages, and it makes the blood race. Great storytellers make us want to stay in the worlds they create, even when there is clearly horror or even pain involved. Think of the pleasures of entering the worlds created by Marquez or Kafka or Malamud, even though they all transport us into worlds of pain. The paradox is that they also reach us and connect us to a vision of humanity, including our own. So fiction, even when it is morally ambiguous, as Hawthorne's or O'Connor's, Hemingway's, or Mansfield's, or Paley's, fiction can speak to truth. And that often means a vision of what life or the human condition represents, as vexing and disquieting and painful as that can often be. And we've seen this. We've seen it in the sad plight of the love-lost boy in Araby, or the vision of unrelenting violence in Isaac Babel's My First Goose and Hemingway's The Killers. Presented in ways that are convincing of a truth without the author having to step in to influence or convince us, without the author having to take even a role in the story that would be made to influence or convince us. Short stories are often intense, and some authors like Chekhov and Grace Paley and Raymond Carver were never able, for whatever reason, to find their way to the completion of a full novel, though Chekhov wrote plays and Paley and Carver wrote poetry, a good deal of poetry in both cases. Stories get written and revised and revised and revised, and often, as in the case of Raymond Carver and his early editor, Gordon Lish, stories are affected in major ways by editors. Many of the single stories, as we have seen, can stand apart from, but are part of connected collections of short fiction, often with unified themes and the breadth or design or arch of a novel. But stories are sui generis. They're a form that is distinct, and to be masterpieces, they need to live. And though there are rare exceptions of one-time drafts like Shirley Jackson's writing of The Lottery or Cynthia Ozick's writing of a famous story called The Shawl, most story writing is a process that begins with an idea, an image, a kernel or piece of a story, or an experience or an anecdote, legend or a folktale. But then the writer's craft has to come into it. There has to be a structuring. There has to be a voice that's found. There has to be a way of moving from a beginning to an end. They say, in fact, about writing short stories, the most difficult in writing them are the takeoffs and the landings. Remember Margaret Atwood's story about all that goes in between being the fun of the story. Well, we might take that in mind when we think about the actual way that stories are composed. They're often composed through many drafts and many revisions. Certainly novels are as well. Poetry is. Drama is. One should not think because a story is shorter that there's less industry involved or there's less work involved, because quite the contrary, many stories involve many, many drafts and much revision. The challenging part then comes in, how to take that raw material, the ore to be mined, and structure and craft it in such a way that it becomes a story, let alone a short fiction masterpiece. Some might say, like the popular poker game Texas Hold'em, that short story writing, given its necessity for intensity of narrative drive, is a young man or a young woman's game. Most of the authors in this course, with the exceptions of Henry James, Nadine Gordimer, and Bernard Malamud, were in their 20s, 30s, or early 40s, and some, as we have seen, were quite ill and died young. I'm not certain that there is a correlation here because there are so many story writers who fall outside of the younger years paradigm and who continue to write stories into their later years. John Barth, born in 1930. Nobel laureate Doris Lessing, born in 1919. They continue to write short fiction into the 21st century. And Jorge Luis Borges, born in 1899, was still writing short fiction right up until his death in 1986. I'm not sure it's a young person's game, but the intensity of youth and perhaps of knowing that one is fatally ill can and do play a role. There are more short stories out there in the globalized and much more literate world of ours than we can take count of. Thousands and thousands still in print from years gone by. How many are masterpieces? Probably hundreds, it's safe to say. Masterpieces of short fiction have, until recently, been overshadowed by the novel, which was generally accorded higher esteem as a craft because of its larger canvas and its expansiveness. You remember, in fact, there was a whole debate about the novel between Henry James and H.G. Wells. Should it be expansive or should it be compact? Should it be selective or should it be saturated? Well, you can apply that same kind of division certainly to how we weigh and how we evaluate short fiction, but those kinds of theories about the novel were much more prevalent. The novel was a genre that simply received a great deal more attention, scholarly as well as critical. I believe, with our fast pace of life and the brevity of messages that come to us over email and on the internet, that this has already undergone much change. It's increasingly difficult, however, for short fiction writers to find publishers. The New Yorker remains the gold standard and publishes some of the world's finest living writers. Yet the New Yorker has reduced its publication of fiction to one story per issue from what used to be 2 or 3, and other magazines have either also cut down on short fiction or simply cut out their being published altogether. It may highlight the nature of the recent and present commercial market that Playboy magazine is the best paying, or at least one of the best paying magazines for short fiction, attracting some of the finest of our short fiction writers because of the high fees it offers, including Malamud, Jackson, Paley, Marquez, and Updike, who have all published short fiction in Playboy. Those who love great stories should certainly read and ought to read the New Yorker stories. Stories are still being published in literary quarterlies and magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's and other higher quality magazines both here in the U.S. and abroad, as well as the market for what are categorized as women's stories, the kind of magazine Shirley Jackson used to publish in, or men's stories that fit men's magazines geared toward that particular market. And there are, of course, mystery magazines, and there are, of course, suspense and horror magazines and so forth. But overall, the market for short fiction in magazines and the world of publishing is similar to what we have seen in the decline in the market for poetry. I'm urging reading more of stories by authors in general, but also, of course, the authors we have read, as well as some of those great storytellers we have not read, such as Barth, Borges, Lessing, and Ozick, as well as some of the other important names that I've dropped throughout my lectures. There's a bevy of great short fiction writers that would have to include John Cheever and Catherine Ann Porter, Alice Munro and William Faulkner, as well as more seminal figures like Flaubert, Melville, Edith Wharton, and Sherwood Anderson. and the more global and ethnic writers who have come along over the past few decades and added enormous richness to the canon. Those hybridized identities I spoke of in my lecture on Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman. So, some concluding remarks about short fiction masterpieces. The novel may, as V.S. Naipaul and others have said, be playing itself out, but it's doubtful that the short story will. As Nadine Gordimer suggested, it appears to be the literary form for our era, even as the traditional markets and magazines for short stories appear to be in serious decline and quite diminished. Mid-century, in the last century, was the high point for the genre as far as magazines, but it appears to be having a kind of morphed resurgence in different forms, both oral and via the internet. With the decline of the power of stories to be central as they once were to small magazines, it used to be, here in the United States, for example, that readers couldn't wait till a magazine came out so that they could read a story, a specific story, by a specific writer. But this market has tremendously diminished, especially for unheralded and unestablished writers. It's very difficult if you're a fledgling writer or you're just starting out to get your work published. Very demanding. I'm not only talking about in a volume of stories or a collection of stories. I'm talking about just getting a story out there if you're not a recognized writer in a magazine or in a journal. Yet stories will continue to be told to a growing degree in different venues and in changing ways. We've seen this, for example, in poetry. Vis-a-vis slam poetry, a whole phenomenon of fast spritzing, recited performance poetry that grew in part out of rap but now involves venues and competitions all over the world. And there are places where you can go and actually hear people read their stories, like the old coffee houses in the bohemian world that once existed in a kind of subterranean way that had people reading poetry and stories. But what you see in some of these venues, surprisingly, are younger people reading stories from creative writing workshops in universities, or reading stories simply that have nothing to do with universities, that they want to share with the public in the way that, say, poets have traditionally orally shared their work. Stories will always be told and heard orally. As Margaret Atwood says, from listening to the stories of others, we learn to tell our own. And she's not only talking about the fact that we learn stories in the way that we would put them into print from listening to other stories, but it's the oral nature of storytelling that she's emphasizing. And we've come a kind of full circle, because you may recall that a lot of the antecedents, a lot of the roots of early short stories in print were indeed oral stories, folk tales, and tales that were passed down from one generation to another through oral storytelling. We've read great masterpieces, and within this genre the emphasis ought to be on pieces, for indeed great stories are pieces of life. And many of those great pieces, as we've seen, have grown harsher in their view of life and the human condition. And that's happened as faith has been eroded. The major wars of the last century have had their immeasurable impacts on civilization. Still, despite the more downbeat and tragic content in many stories, there are stories like Atwood's that can amuse us, stories like Carver's which can lift us, and there are the lessons that we learn about life and even the most tragic of the great stories that help us to enhance our understanding and our humanity. Great stories are ultimately all about being human and experiencing what it is like to be human, which often can mean suffering and despair. There is the story on its surface, and there is all that is beneath that surface, just as Hawthorne's Goodman Brown or Chekhov's Dmitri Gurov realized there is a latent or secret meaning beneath all human action. Or think, if you will, of Hemingway's iceberg effect, or what is often described as patent and latent meanings in short fiction. Great stories have in them, simply put, great levels of meaning to excavate. What has changed, even for those characters who do not change in fiction, is the ordinariness of so many of the characters we meet in short fiction, and the breakdown of the once shackling and confining confines of gender, race, class, and ethnicity. Aristotle's idea of tragedy in the Poetics was of a high-placed man, a king like Oedipus or Lear, falling from high stature. Now, short fiction includes the general acceptance of characters from all walks and stations of life by writers of all backgrounds. Goodman Brown, Akaki, the Loycells, Nick Adams, Laura Sheridan, Virginia in An Interest in Life, Baldwin's brothers, not the Baldwin brothers, by the way, in Sonny's Blues, and Updike's Sammy in A&P, or Carver's pot-smoking narrator in Cathedral. These are all, I need to add, memorable and dynamic or round characters as opposed to being static or flat characters. They're characters whose lives stay with us, whose humanity stays with us. It was E.M. Forster, by the way, who first made that distinction, and it's an important one, between flat and round characters in a book called Aspects of the Novel. Flat characters simply being one-dimensional, cardboard, round characters being more nuanced and more multidimensional. Today, many stories are told to us in films or on television. In fact, written short fiction is still a major source for film and television scriptwriters, but film and television are different than the written word. The emphasis, obviously, is visual, usually shot by shot. And they require writers, as well as actors, producers, directors, and a slew of others in collaboration. When you write a script, you're usually writing dialogue, or you're setting the scene visually, outdoors, indoors, wherever. But the story is one person's words upon the page, and the story can open up a world because the words can do that, the language can do that. The language can transport us into that world in ways that go far beyond the visual. Am I making a case for short stories over film or over television? No, not necessarily. I'm saying they're all different media. But you can get much more out of the short story in many different directions than you can get out of just about any other medium. There has been, and will continue to be, a continuum of realism on the one hand in stories, and experimentation with stories that stray from the boundaries of realism. Much of the avant-garde experiments associated with short story writers who veered away from traditional realistic or plot-centric stories can be seen in the metafiction example of Margaret Atwood's Happy Endings, or in a short impressionistic piece that is like a shower of innumerable atoms. That's Virginia Woolf's phrase, and that's a famous story that we also, alas, could not include, which I highly recommend, Virginia Woolf's Kew Gardens, which is told, at least in part, even from the point of view of a snail. There's a well-established 20th century tradition for these kinds of experimental stories, which sometimes, especially when they're devoid of a plot, seem to be not like stories at all, but more like poetry. And they can be seen in experimental work of fiction writers like Vladimir Nabokov and Italo Calvino, or American innovators of form and language like Donald Barthelme, John Barth, Robert Coover, Ursula Le Guin, or the great Argentinian storyteller Jorge Luis Borges, who defended the short story as being essential. And by the way, Borges has been one of its chief contemporary innovators. Chekhov, however, is the father of the modern short story, and the most influential figure to come along after Poe, Hawthorne, and Gogol with his wider canvas, his inclusion of the complications of ordinary human life without the necessity of including the shocking, the sensational, the moralizing, or the supernatural, like we find in Hawthorne and Gogol. Though those elements remain, and horror particularly remains, in later stories like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery or Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. Chekhov gave us the real thing, but then so, of course, in a different and highly dissimilar way, did the only short story writer who has had the title master conferred on him, Henry James. Americans have been most prominent in the evolution of the short story, and Melville, with longer stories like Bartleby the Scrivener and Benito Cereno, again, stories, unfortunately, that we couldn't do, but that could well fit into the masterpiece category, or the sketches that Melville wrote, even the sketches that he wrote in the Encantadas, which move adroitly along that thin line between fact and fiction. Melville really helped establish what William Boyd has called the benchmark for what the short story can attain. Other stories we have discussed by Lawrence, Marquez, and Malamud veer away from traditional links to realism, or to the creation of a world that is, in Kafka's The Hunger Artist, an alternate world. And so one has to ask why writers who began to focus more on realistic renderings began characteristically to bring to the fore in fiction the voices of the unacknowledged or of the silent, not people falling from high places, but really the masses of small people. And part of the answer to that question appears to lie in the combination of democratic principles that have gained hold in the West and the mass circulation of magazines to an international public of burgeoning literacy. But there's also the fact that nearly all of the writers under our scrutiny were so often from or identify with nations that recently underwent or were heading toward revolutionary upheaval, up to and including Maxine Hong Kingston with Mao's China, and Nadine Gordimer with the Apartheid regime that was dismantled in South Africa. The effects of the American Revolution can be seen in the ways in which more common and ordinary lives became the focus of American writers, from Hawthorne through Updike and Carver. The major dismantling of traditional structures and hierarchies apply to the impact of the French and Russian revolutions, and the concomitant changing nature of common folk being at the center of stories of writers like Maupassant and The Necklace, or the stories leading up to the 1917 Russian Bolshevik Revolution by Gogol and Chekhov, or Babel's My First Goose, which followed the revolution. Political upheaval and revolutionary political change were also occurring in Joyce's Ireland and Marquez's Colombia. It's also no accident that such a greater democratization of short fiction writing would eventually allow for more writers of Jewish origin, such as Kafka, Babel, Paley, Malamud, and Gordimer, or from the working class like Updike and Carver, as well as more women writers, Mansfield, Jackson, O'Connor, Paley, Kingston, and Atwood, and more writers of color like Marquez, Baldwin, and Kingston. In addition to the writers we've studied, one can add many more names and stories to the list of authors, and stories that deserve masterpiece status. It is, by the way, no accident that we see so many writers in our pantheon who were or have also been social or political, engaged activists from a political left that has characteristically been focused on working for or championing seismic changes involving a desire for greater egalitarianism and breaking down traditional structures or hierarchies. This is especially true following the Second World War, as writers like Jackson, Marquez, Paley, Malamud, Atwood, Kingston, and Gordimer were all influenced by the specter of fascism nearly overrunning the world. The prominence of women fiction writers and writers of ethnic origins has been nothing short of astonishing, given the difficulty they had for so long of breaking through into being recognized as mainstream writers. Bill Moyer's interview with Nobel laureate and African-American writer Toni Morrison is instructive here. When Moyer's, a famous television interview, asked Miss Morrison if she was going to move more from the margins to write about the center, her response was that Mr. Moyer should be the one moving to her center. To quote Yeats, the center cannot hold, leastwise the old center of a canon free of color and ethnicity, and sparse where women short fiction writers have been concerned. Truth be told, the short story has been a truly democratizing genre. The canon has also opened up and continues to open up to a globalized world of storytelling, and storytellers emerging along with the globalized economies and the advent and spread of the World Wide Web. The canon is being challenged and will continue to be challenged by change and fluctuations in taste and alternate poles of value, such as the aesthetic and the political. Yet stories move along past prompted by current events and politics in ways they never had in the past. American literature is instructive here. After the Vietnam War, there was a spate of short fiction writers like Tim O'Brien, Philip Caputo, and Robert Stone, who all wrote stories about the war or its aftermath and the effects on ordinary men, women, and children. But read popular and widely anthologized stories like Tobias Wolff's Hunters in the Snow or T.C. Boyle's Greasy Lake, and you see the unmistakable influence of the Vietnam War in narratives not tied to the war. India-born Bharati Mukherjee writes a story based on a historic incident involving a deadly terrorist act aboard a commercial airliner. The management of grief is global in its sweep and moves from Canada to Ireland and then to India before returning back to Canada. A contemporary Indian-American storyteller, also a Bengali, Jhumpa Lahiri, writes a moving story about man going to the moon and an immigrant's encounter with a 100-year-old American landlady. Based on Lahiri's father's story, it also moves over 3 continents, from India to England to the United States. And in another Lahiri story, the war between India and Pakistan plays an integral role. The point is, stories have expanded to become more global, to be more rooted in history or politics, autobiography or biography. And there are still gold standard literary magazines like The New Yorker that publish writers such as Updike and Gordimer, or short story writers of great stature like the Canadian Alice Munro, whom many regard as our most outstanding contemporary short story writer. But once leading outlets like the Partisan Review, which published Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, no longer exist. American short fiction writing is exemplary, too, of the changing nature of the demographic landscape. With a few notable exceptions, the most prominent and often anthologized short fiction writers now tend to be women, like the prolific writer Joyce Carol Oates, or a working-class writer who focuses her stories on the lower middle class of Kentucky, Bobby Ann Mason, or women of color such as Edwidge Danticat, originally from Haiti, and Jamaica Kincaid, originally from the West Indies, who both have produced exceptional fiction dealing with material drawn from their lives and their countries of origin, or the lives they have lived in the United States as immigrants. Alice Walker, ZZ Packer, and Toni Cade Bambara, who write of their own personal experiences as urban African American women, or writers Leslie Marmon Silko and Louise Erdrich, who write stories of Indian American life and identify their stories in realism but combine myth and folk traditions. Helen Viramontes and Sandra Cisneros, who write of Mexican American identity and poverty as an immigrant in the case of Viramontes and as the daughter of immigrants in Cisneros' case. We also have Amy Tan, Gish Jen, and Jade Snow Wong, that trio of Chinese American women writers I mentioned in my lecture on Maxine Hong Kingston, and the two Indian South Asian variety women writers that I mentioned before, Bharati Mukherjee and Jhumpa Lahiri. Multiculturalism and hybrid identities have become commonplace. Who would have imagined it with Poe and Hawthorne? The realistic and plot-driven story appears to be holding greater sway for the present, but this has always shifted back and forth and may indeed continue to do so. What we have seen transpire historically in the evolution of the short story is a movement from tales and fables and sketches to Chekhovian realism, involving perceptions of the subjectivity of ordinary people that involve us in an increasingly secular and existential world, with ongoing significant changes as the form opens up and techniques such as stream of consciousness and interior monologue become commonplace, and stylistics change, and so do the roles of autobiography and history. One would be hard-pressed to find more influential figures than Chekhov or Hemingway, but much has changed since Hemingway, and especially since Chekhov, in the evolution of short fiction, and much doubtless will continue to change as the canon opens up. For short fiction masterpieces now and in the immediate future, there are hard times, but still for serious readers and lovers of the genre, so much to read and so much to study. John Cheever, one of our finest 20th century short story writers and one of the many writers we might have included in this course, were there world enough and time, said, "So long as we are possessed by experience that is distinguished by its intensity and its episodic nature, we will have the short story in our literature, and without our literature, we will, of course, perish." Worlds of great storytelling are out there for us to engage in and continue the ongoing conversations. Stay alive with short fiction and keep short fiction alive.